Well, what's new in this issue of Vanity Fair was the very first time that the Ransom Note is published in full. We've been getting little morsels and bits of it. The district attorney has released this line or that line. And what we see for the first time in this issue is the extent of this note.
And then you'll notice the writer of the Vanity Fair article. Yeah, you've got a writer talking about the author of the Ransom Note, and she laughs. She's quite frankly amused by how silly it is. And she should be, and we should be amused as well.
In fact, this is an extraordinary document. It's 3 pages long. It rambles on and on. It is clearly amateurish and adolescent.
Well, I'm not sure if it is. I'm not sure if it is adolescent, although if you source things from movies, it might feel that way. I'm not sure if it's amateurish either. What I mean is the Ransom Note isn't quite as silly and as amateurish as it seems. Why? Well, because whoever wrote it was able to successfully disguise their handwriting in a way that it has never been, as far as we know, definitively linked to a particular author. And I think that's quite an achievement. For a 3-page note with so much handwriting on display, that is quite an achievement. Now, for the past 28 years, we've taken a detailed approach to the Ramsay Ransom Note. That's important and necessary, but what I feel we've missed and what's been needed is a big picture approach to the note as well. In this analysis, I want you to think of the mystery and the intrigue around investigating the note as an analogy for the entire Ramsay case. Think about the way we thought about and approached the note and the way the note has been handled from different quarters as an analogy for the entire Ramsay case, and you'll see what I mean as we go through this. In other words, I want you to see the parallels, the patterns, the similarities surrounding how the ridiculous ransom note was treated and thought about and investigated, and also the transparency or the lack of to the public regarding this note. All of this as an analogy to the entire Ramsay case. And we begin this process by asking a very straightforward question. What was the ransom note really trying to say? If you've got your notebooks out, now's the time to write your answer. What do you think the ransom note was really trying to say?
Alteration of the crime scene. The purpose of the note is to mislead investigators, to make them think this is a kidnap for ransom, when in fact it's been a homicide.
Right, that's what he said. That's right. Incomplete. Incomplete.
We need to differentiate between the purpose of the ransom note and what is it trying to say. These are two very different questions with two very different answers. Now, of all the commentators, pundits, and blowhards associated with the Ramsay case, I probably respect McCreary most of all. He's definitely, if not at the top of the list, very close to the top. Another one is Ron Walker. But think about it, the purpose of the note isn't to mislead investigators. Well, it is, but the more important issue is how and in what way. How and in what way? Well, isn't the answer fairly obvious? What the ransom note is really trying to say is simply this: JONBENET isn't here. And we can even address that to the purpose of the ransom note. You might say the purpose is to mislead. Well, how and in what way? Well, the purpose of the ransom note is also to say, to show, JONBENET isn't here. Because this note's here, JONBENET isn't here. Think about these words right in the beginning of the note. We have your daughter in our possession. That's overkill right there. If they have JONBENET, obviously she's in their possession. All they need to say is, we have your daughter. A better word is custody, but it's superfluous even to say that. The writer is overemphasizing that JONBENET is somewhere else, under someone else's control, when she isn't. Now think of Patsy's first words during the 911 call.
There's a note left and our daughter's gone.
Gone is also interesting. At this point, JONBENET was gone, as in deceased. So in a certain manner of interpretation, saying there's a note left and our daughter's gone, that's true. JONBENET is gone. And that is in a way why the note is there to begin with. And then Patsy repeats her statement to the operator.
Just tell the note. And my daughter's did the same.
And then a third time.
Please, we just got out and she right here.
And that is the purpose of the note, to communicate that JONBENET is not here, but JONBENET is here.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Well, it's the day after Christmas. I hope you've had a good Christmas. I hope the aftermath is still warm and fuzzy. In this analysis, we're going to deal with the ransom note, and we're going to follow that up with the autopsy analysis. Now, if an intruder didn't write the note, if the Ramsays wrote it with all its contrivances, then they wrote it to prevent the discovery of JONBENET's body in their home, and they wrote it knowing that JONBENET was dead, and they had hidden her body and also altered it, changing clothes and adding duct tape to make the crime scene seem more adult perhaps and extreme than it really was. And think about the indictment voted on by the grand jurors. It was dealing with the prevention of the discovery of JONBENET, or at least evidence of a crime, and wasn't the major factor in this the ransom note. And this raises another very important question, and another one you might want to jot down in your notebook. Why was it so important to hide what had happened to JONBENET? And some people have rightly asked me, well, if it was an accident, why would you want to hide what happened to JONBENET? Well, her death was an accident, but the other things surrounding her death I don't think were an accident, and that's really what needs to be hidden. Another dimension to this question is that we need to know what happened to JONBENET and what the perpetrator stood to lose at that juncture, at that moment in time. The intruder could lose his freedom, but if the Ramsays wrote the note, what could they lose?
I could lose a lot. Me personally, I could lose a lot.
In this analysis, we're going to look at 10 aspects, 10 insights about the ransom note that you've probably not thought about. Or if you have, we're going to go into those issues into more depth. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Welcome to the thousands of you who have subscribed over the last few days. Welcome to the channel. I do want to challenge you guys to try to listen for longer. I've seen some people becoming very indignant, like, how dare you ask us to listen for longer? But you know, there's a relationship between IQ and attention span. Intelligence is actually linked to the ability to ignore distractions. And in this analysis, we're going to be dealing with the ransom note as a test of our ability to recognize distractions, recognize something that is misleading us, and then know what to focus on. But a lot of that requires concentration to begin with. And I certainly would like to think that my videos and my channel is something that is stimulating your intelligence level, because did you know a person's intelligence level is tied to their ability to concentrate? Which I guess is another way of saying, if you can listen to the end of my videos, that means you are more intelligent than someone who can't or who doesn't. All right, and then just a reminder, we'll be dealing with the autopsy evidence in the next video, and I'll be revealing another card with regard to my theory in this case. You're not going to want to miss that. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. Human intelligence is among the most fragile things in nature. It doesn't take much to distract it, suppress it, or even annihilate it. That is a quote from Neil Postman, a cultural critic. Whoever wrote the cryptic ransom note was cynically aware of this fragility of human intelligence, and nowhere in true crime is this more on display than the Ramsay case, especially now.
And the reason offenders stage crime scenes is because without it, they're the primary suspect. So they have to come up with a false motive to try and mislead investigators, and that really is what this note means.
I want you to pause on McCrary's words for a moment. If you're not quite sure who he is, we will introduce him in a bit more detail in a moment. He was basically one of the first people the Ramsays approached to be part of Team Ramsay, and to his credit, he turned them down. Now, if there was no ransom note in this case, and JONBENET was found where she was found, and not by John but by the cops, what would the obvious assumption be? We're going to turn to statistics later in this analysis, but I don't think you even need to be that scientific. You can just use common sense. If we want to look at what's obvious in this situation scientifically, we can. But first, let's walk through this idea of a JONBENET hidden in the basement, but this time with no bizarre ransom note. Are you ready to do that with me? Right, so put on your TCRS thinking caps and let's go through it. Imagine if Patsy called 911 and there was no ransom note. What do you think would have happened? Well, simple. The authorities would have searched the house more thoroughly, not for signs of a break-in, but for JONBENET. They would have had this idea, she's here, instead of the ransom note saying, suggesting, implying, she's not here. And also, they wouldn't have been searching for signs of a break-in, they would be searching for JONBENET. As primary witnesses, they would also have questioned all three occupants of the house a lot more vigorously. They would have questioned these people instead of questioning the note. They would have paid attention to these people instead of paying attention to the note. Also, the 10 a.m. deadline meant the cops had to hurry up and wait for a call that never came, which meant after arriving at 6 a.m., the initial search and investigation was rushed. And now let's jump into the 10 new ransom note insights, give or take. And maybe in your notebooks you might want to specify which of these insights you hadn't thought about before. Number 1, narrative staging.
The note, the first thing that's striking about the note is that it even exists. We have over 25,000 homicides a year in the United States. Very few involve a bogus ransom note or demand note. So it's unusual in that it even exists. And it's important to look at the note in a context, in that sort of a context, and then into the note itself.
The extraordinary thing about the Ramsay case is the sheer scale and scope of narrative staging. Narrative staging is using words to stage, to cover up, to alter a crime scene. In modern parlance, we would say gaslighting. It is using words to alter our perception of things. The 3-page note was just a hint of things to come. Since then, there's been a deluge, a tsunami of apologist books, documentaries, interviews, and all the rest. An argument can be made that this latest Netflix series is the latest in a long wave of narratives that present a stage and a performance meant to direct attention away from the real issues at heart. Number 2, psychological staging. Despite the micro elements within the note,
Content of the note itself, very respectful to Mr. Ramsay, we respect your business, and so forth. Very respectful and deferential to Mr. Ramsay.
Despite the micro attempts within the note at psychological staging, the overall impression of a long, literate, overly familiar essay written at length in the comfort of the Ramsay home with material sourced from the Ramsay home. And all of this is more than enough psychological evidence before one even needs to look at additional details like the handwriting.
It starts off with one kind of penmanship and it visibly changes.
The ransom note abounds with this sort of psychological staging, the misspellings, the movie references, the good Southern common sense comment, the deliberate use of a ransom of $118,000 so that people would wander around that rabbit hole, the dramatic, exaggerated, but also showing guilty knowledge, references to beheaded and denied her remains. There's also the call at 10 a.m. tomorrow ruse, which could buy the writer potentially further delay another day, which is also a big part of the psychological strategy of this case: delay, postpone, obstruct. Think about the overarching psychological strategy here and how much the case was delayed, drawn out, running the clock down. Perhaps the best recent clue to all of this psychological staging is when John Ramsay says, with his lawyer at his right hand,
the real story here is not that a child was murdered. The real story here is what was done to us by an unjust system.
Take it from me, folks. The real story here is that a child was killed. And the unjust system that he talks about isn't anything done to the Ramsays. It was what was done in particular to the good people of Boulder and to an innocent little girl. and the fact that no one has ever been held accountable for it. Number 2, statistics. Have a look at this excerpt from the Guardian newspaper. Statistically speaking, in cases where a child's body is found in the family home, the culprit is almost always a family member perpetrator.
My experience and what I know about child homicides, first of all, we know there's a 12-to-1 probability that when we have a child murder that is done by a family member or a caregiver or someone close to the child, only 1 in 12 is committed by a stranger.
That's under 10%. That means the probability of the intruder theory is less than 10%. And when you add the evidence that militates against it, something McCreary touches on in a second, the probability of the intruder theory being likely plunges arguably even lower to 5% or even lower than that.
And then when we overlay the facts, even as I knew them early on, that the murder occurred in the house, everything seemed to have occurred in the house. The note was in the house. The note was written on a pad from the house. Everything was in the house. And my instinct told me that the killer is going to be in the house or someone very, very close to the child. So I didn't want to get in a position where I was in the camp of a killer and somehow inadvertently defending a child killer.
I suppose it's not 100% convincing.
It's not 1% convincing.
Number 3, strategy around the release of the ransom note.
I was called early in January by an attorney, actually a private investigator working for an attorney for the Ramsays, and they wanted to hire me to work with the Ramsay team to construct a profile, do a crime analysis, and so forth. I declined that offer. As a matter of fact, I had my secretary call back and decline the offer, and I did that for 2 reasons, basically. One, to construct a profile, I would have needed access to all the investigative materials, that is, the crime scene photos, autopsy report, autopsy photos, all the investigation that the police have done, none of which would have been available to me working with the attorneys that wanted to hire me.
So you can see there's a different standard between McCreary, who insists on having access to this information, and John Douglas, who seems to prognosticate on his profile without the benefit and without the need apparently for some of these materials, some of this information as far as we know. It's also fascinating that the ransom note, arguably the biggest, best and most elaborate clue that had been front and center of the case from the get-go, was only released to the public in its full frontal absurdity after the autopsy evidence. Now, the curious thing about the note is that on paper, in the drama and adrenaline of Patsy acting hysterical and in the slick, snowy, glistening darkness, the note achieves a giddy, perhaps even ominous significance. Yet in the cold light of day, the ransom note is nothing more or less than a silly waste of time. And the Ramsays and their handlers seem to sense this, that to release the note in its entirety to the public would only aggravate the public suspicion directed at the parents, that cloud that was already brewing over Boulder. Because who would believe it? And yet it was John Douglas who recommended that they do precisely that, in order to turn over the job of, do you recognize this handwriting, to the public. In my opinion, even though the handwriting was disguised, the writer still didn't want the public to see the note, because certain elements, especially as you know, the handwriting evolves over time, or certain elements, and perhaps the Ramsay housekeeper, for example, may well have recognized some of those elements when Patsy's handwriting was still fresh in her mind, from post-its or handwritten checks from a few days earlier. Can you imagine if the housekeeper could have had access to that whole note very early on? What would she have thought? What would she have said? How would that have influenced public opinion? How would that have influenced her opinion? But what the passage of time could achieve was also amnesia. Amnesia on the one hand, and also for the Ramsays, it would allow them to have time to get their PR up and running and get ahead of the narrative. We see the same thing in the McCann case. And so in the presence of a vacuum, they could conjure, like the note, whatever they wanted, and thus direct the narrative wherever they wanted it to go. And so think about that. You have the vacuum of JONBENET's gone, JONBENET's missing, JONBENET's somewhere in the darkness, we don't know where. In that vacuum, oh, here's a ransom note. The same thing. In the aftermath, you have a vacuum. Well, guess what? We're going to put notes in terms of in media and advertisements and interviews, and we're going to thus direct the narrative in that way. And so one of the first things they did was present an image of themselves weeping on the steps of a church. And someone actually said they totally used the church as a photo opportunity. Number 4, strategy around public discussion of the ransom note. If we take our cues from the Ramsays not only during the kidnapping phase but in the aftermath, then we should also give the ransom note low priority. In other words, if we take how the Ramsays' attitude to the ransom note as a leadership way of saying this is how we need to treat it, well then we should treat it with not particularly a high level of importance. Even during the 911 call, the operator, when she asked,
Tell the note. Oh my God, does it say who took her? What? Does it say who took her? I don't know.
Here Patsy's asked, well, you've got the note. What does it say in the note about taking JONBENET? And Patsy answers, I don't know. Well, Patsy, perhaps pick up the damn note and look, because there are references to 2 gentlemen and references to her being safe and references to a foreign faction and Southern, none of which are mentioned by Patsy. She also doesn't mention that they're going to call at 10 a.m., which could have helped prepare the police for what was about to happen. Now, why does all of this matter? Well, because she wants you to lead yourself down rabbit holes, right? This ransom note wants to lead you down rabbit holes rather than to be seen doing so. In other words, why doesn't Patsy herself ever make these references when dealing with the ransom note? Because the whole idea is that your psychology takes you into those areas. And for somebody else to do that, well, it's going to look very dubious and doubtful indeed. Also, I want you to look at Patsy's body language when she's on Larry King and she's asked about the first time she sees the note. Do you notice the long blocking blink?
It's early morning, before daylight.
You're up? Mm-hmm. Then what happens?
Then I go down the spiral staircase, and there on one of the runs of the stair is the 3-page ransom note.
Remember, this interview was from 2000, so Patsy had to have been feeling pretty good about the situation. No one was suspecting her, and the ransom note had actually effectively done its job. I mean, in not implicating the Ramsays.
I don't know the details, but I know the ransom note, they think the handwriting matched.
Have you seen it? Have you read it?
I don't think I've read the whole thing. I've definitely seen pictures of it, though.
Again, are we supposed to take our cue from Burke? Well, just look at a couple of pictures, don't really read the ransom note. And then, of course, Dr. Phil has a copy of the note there, shows it to Burke. Burke doesn't even take it from his hands, doesn't study it himself. If it's the first time in 20 years that he has that opportunity, he still doesn't take it.
How do you think differently now about the ransom note than you did day one?
Well,
at least I have to imagine, if it were me, I imagine that I've picked this thing apart 10 ways to Sunday.
it didn't make sense, first of all.
If it were me, I imagine that I've picked this thing apart 10 ways to Sunday.
It didn't make sense, first of all.
Those who believe she wrote it perpetuate the idea that she wrote it is because it seems like it's not a clear answer or direction of how much of the note she saw, because initially she's it's your daughter, we have your daughter, and then she goes up and looks, but then she talks about later looking out the window and seeing that it's a marked car and being concerned, and people will say, oh, how did you know that that was later on the note? People will say, oh, when she calls 911, how does she know how it's signed if she only saw the first page? 30 years ago.
Yeah, I don't know.
You see, John really doesn't have very much to say about it, and this was recorded just a couple of weeks ago. 28 years later, he still doesn't have very much to say about it.
The note was lying across the 3 pages across the run of one of the stair treads, and it was kind of dimly lit. It was very early in the morning, and I started to read it, and it was addressed to John. It said, Mr. Ramsay. And it said, "We have your daughter." And it just wasn't registering. And I may have gotten through another sentence, like, "We have your daughter," and I don't know if I got any further than that.
So one really has the impression that not one of the three Ramsay family members have really paid that much attention to the ransom note, or if they have, that they want to really comment on it. They don't really seem to have too much to say about it. And that brings us to number 5, details not discussed. Now, this is an excerpt that you don't hear about very much in the ransom note. It's near the end of the 3rd page. "You stand a 99% chance of killing your daughter if you try to outsmart us. Follow our instructions and you stand a 100% chance of getting her back." Now, this is a very interesting comment from Linda Wilcox, a former housekeeper of the Ramsays. And these are Linda's words. "She grabbed her notepad and her felt tip pen. That is not her language, but the essence of her is there, like the percentages. 99% chance and 100% chance, that is how she talked, because of her cancer, or how you talk when you are around someone with cancer." Such an interesting insight there. And the phrase, "that good southern common sense of yours, John wasn't from the South, but Patsy and Nidra always teased him about being from the South." Now, besides the hypocrisy of the ransom note, in disguising the handwriting and also in issuing instructions by a writer who has no intention whatsoever of following up on them, we'll have a look at just how poorly disguised these letters are. The wobbly W's. And look at there's some consistency in the wobbly W that lasts for 3 lines. But go through the rest of the ransom note and look at the others. Look at the T that is positively gargantuan. The bottom tail added as a pedestal in both letters, as if the writer lifted up the pen and was constructing or creating letters rather than simply writing them down. The T in represent is wobbly, and ultimately all 3 T's don't look the same in this line, either in shape or size. Here the writer probably realized what a tedious exercise disguising the whole note was going to be. But if she was an artist, and if she was used to tedious sketches and practicing to get shapes and nuances right, and that is something artists need to do and artists do go through, either on paper and canvas, well then this was just another artwork. And now look at the squiggly tail of the letter D. And then in the very next line, the tail in the D in "and" is perfectly straight and perfectly vertical. The wobbly L's become steadier in each successive line, from will to bills again. Now, besides the evolution of the handwriting in the note, there's also narrative inconsistency throughout the Ramsay case. The order in which Patsy says she found JONBENET missing, then the note, then that she first found the note and then JONBENET missing. The outright denial of any sexual element initially, which has now transformed into an overly sexual paedophile monster who committed a violent SA. Well, that is something that is not borne out by the autopsy results. I also want to mention what I call the narrative hypocrisy of the Ramsay case. If the district attorney and the Ramsays leak evidence, and obviously this is to bolster their case and make the Ramsays look innocent, that's fine. If someone else does, they need to be investigated. And that's something Anne Bardach also highlighted in her interview. Also, if the Ramsays don't cooperate, and even the district attorney admitted to Vanity Fair that their lawyering up was odd and not cooperating, that was his words. He said, the fact that they do not cooperate is most compelling. Right, so even he said that. Well, that's fine, but if the district attorney shoots the entire case in the foot, well, we're not going to talk about that. If the Boulder PD don't test or release evidence, that's a scandal. But if the Ramsays lawyers prevent information from being released, clothing, bank and phone records, medical records, well, that's okay. Number 6, Patsy is asked if she ever touched the note.
And the note was turned over by the Ramsays, was it not?
It was found there.
Right.
Patsy Ramsay reported on that morning that, well, she had actually 2 versions which are outlined in the story. She told police initially, according to police reports, the first time she said she went in to her daughter's room, found her not present, and ran down to the kitchen, and on the back spiral stairs found the ransom note laid out, all 3 pages. Later, she said that, in fact, she went down to make coffee at 5:30 and stumbled on the ransom note and then ran upstairs and found her child missing.
So did you follow that? The question is, so the note was turned over, right? Meaning the pages turned over. And Bardak says, no, it was found there. So Patsy confirmed that she never picked up the note when questioned directly about it at the end of April 1997. Trujillo asks, okay, you pick up the note and start to read it. You go back upstairs to JONBENET's room. Is that right? Patsy, well, I don't remember if I picked it up or just leaned over and read it. I can't remember. I don't think I picked it up because I remember just then bounding up the stairs toward her room. Now, this failure by the Ramsays to handle the note when it would be unreasonable not to shows just how much sensitivity but also overthinking went into trying not to leave a trail of incriminating evidence, in my opinion. Number 7, how did the note get from the stairs to the floor to Officer French's hands? Remember, Officer French didn't pick the note up from the stairs but from the floor. So how did it get to the floor? And how did Officer French end up with the note in his hands?
Quickly.
Yeah.
You brought the note to John?
I don't remember, I tell you. You just, that
You
morning
remember how you got the
so
note?
chaotic.
You don't?
I don't remember exactly, but
Well, it was.
I started screaming, there's a note,
Same as number 6, the fact that Patsy not only doesn't pick the note up but doesn't take it and hand it to John, and John doesn't pick it up either, is almost as absurd as the note itself. Number 8, the note is a kind of clothing, just as JONBENET is wearing clothing. But the question is, what's underneath? Think about the reality of this case. At its core, underneath everything, what is underneath everything? Well, there's a sexual motive and a sexual element. And I've put up a video with a heart on a hand, and a lot of people have ridiculed it and said I don't see a heart. I mean, we can deal with that aspect, the fact of who thought it was a heart, all the main detectives in this case, but these people think that they know a lot better. They know better than the coroner. Pretty much they know better than everyone in this case. And if you think about Christmas from a totally different perspective, Christmas can be a very romantic and even magical time. This is especially so for children, not so much the romance of Christmas, but the magic of Christmas. There may be a kind of element to it that is going to really touch a child's heart in a certain way. We do know that in Japan, Christmas is treated like Valentine's Day. Just think about how romantic it is. These lights that are blinking, all of this warm and fuzzy stuff going on. I think it's easy to have feelings of love during Christmas time, and maybe some of those feelings of love can and often are romantic. I mean, there's songs, Last Christmas I Gave You My Heart, but the very next day, etc., And I do think we stumble upon a really interesting insight. And if you've been concentrating and listening to this point, this is something you're really going to want to scribble down in your notebook. That is essentially, I think, what's being hidden, the sexual motive. Not only, this is the crucial part, not only by the accessories to this crime, but importantly, by the killer himself. The killer himself is also hiding away a sexual element. And this is also what differentiates this case from a stranger attack. Consider the following. Although there was a sexual element, JONBENET was not found naked like so many of these sorts of victims are. Take the Delphi case, for example. 2 victims, one left naked, the other redressed, but in the wrong clothing. JONBENET was also redressed partially in different clothing, some sizes too large for her. And it's not even clear if the killer actually executed his sexual intentions in the Delphi case. In this sense, I think the Delphi case, very broadly, is similar to the Ramsay case. Someone had sexual intent, got spooked, and a little girl died in the process. The difference, I think, in the one is that the killing is absolutely deliberate, whereas in the other, it's accidental. Meredith Kurtz is a bad example here because instead of covering something up, her body was staged, her body was moved across the floor and her legs open to look like something worse had happened than was really the case. And this also implicated a male attacker and seemed to vindicate a female suspect. And I think in the same way, by exaggerating the level of violence, which the ransom note tries to do, and which all the narrative staging tries to do, it suggests a particular kind of perpetrator, an adult male. JONBENET was staged to look like something worse had happened than was really the case. Well, the ransom note as well. Think about how the staging of the ransom note and the staging of JONBENET herself both try to exaggerate the kind of perpetrator. Number 9, the ransom note is designed to create rabbit holes. 30% of Americans read at a level that you would expect from a 10-year-old child. That is a quote from Andreas Schleicher, the Director for Education and Skills at the OECD. Schleicher worries that people with poor literacy skills will become naive consumers of prefabricated content. Now, I would suggest that those with poor literacy were taken in by the ransom note. But I would also say it takes someone with superior literacy to know how to fool someone with inferior literacy. And I think this is how and why Anne Bardak is such an excellent person to be dealing with the ransom note in her excellent article, one of the best ever written, if not the best, on the Ramsay case. And I think Patsy Ramsay, I think you've also got to remember, is also one of the few people in this case that has got really advanced literacy, that she studied journalism at university. There's one other person that has that sort of level of language proficiency, and that is Bill McReynolds, the man who played Santa Claus. And I think we can in a way understand the whole Ramsay case through the ransom note, through this idea of someone with superior literacy fooling others with inferior literacy. And instead of literacy, think about it as knowledge of the case. So in other words, someone with a lot more knowledge of the case knows how to pull the wool over the eyes of those who are ignorant or don't have as much knowledge of the case. And this is why context is so important. The ransom note author tries to dumb herself down, but then slips up when she used the words like attaché. And then the final point here, the ransom note succeeds, sort of. As much as we may ridicule the ransom note, I think it is quite impressive in what it's achieved. You know, those taken in 28 years ago by the ransom note, and this apparently includes the likes of Lou Sherlock Holmes Smith and FBI legend John Douglas. You know, those taken in by the Ramsay ransom note, those people are the future consumers of AI. Those are the future naive audience for fake news. And look how well fake news is doing in the modern era. It's just doing better and better. And increasingly, you know, more and more people are unable to tell the difference between fiction and fake reality and reality. And this is, you know, if you're still listening at this point, you can see the real value of this whole discussion, the real meaning about discussing something as old and tired as the Ramsay ransom note, because it starts to deal with our ability to discern the difference between something that is true, legitimate, authentic, and something that's not, something that is meant to manipulate us. Are we able to withstand these manipulations? Well, the Ramsay ransom note is a good analogy to all of that. And I want to end off by referring to an article from the Financial Times published just a couple of hours ago, which is titled, "Are We Becoming a Post-Literate Society?" In other words, without solid skills of your own, this is from the article, without solid literacy skills of your own, it is only a few short steps from being supported by the machine to finding yourself dependent on it, or even worse, subject to it. Us becoming subjected to machine intelligence. If we're not going to become any smarter than we are, well, smart machines are going to start calling the shots. So we'd better be careful. The Ramsay case proves just how easy it is to become subject to the machine of misinformation. It is interesting to see that in 2024, all the media, I've only seen one exception to that, and I will be covering that hopefully before the end of the year. Virtually all the media covering this case and giving John Ramsay a platform have, by implication, been fooled, been duped, been successfully manipulated by the ransom note. It's pretty incredible. It's pretty shocking. It's pretty embarrassing. What this shows is that it's not only about literacy, it's about the length of attention spans, and even more pertinently, critical thinking. And we're seeing the length of attention spans, especially in media people, also decreasing. A study was conducted recently showing critical thinking skills globally are plummeting, and this is going hand in hand. This is going on hand in hand with plummeting attention spans. Plummeting attention spans, plummeting critical thinking means overall, collectively, we are becoming not only a dumber species, but a species that's more and more easily duped. Having said that, not everyone has been. And if you're here listening to this right here, if you're one of those with still intact concentrations, well, here's my advice, my encouragement, my challenge to you. Keep reading, keep paying attention, keep sharpening that saw, because the world, especially going into the next phase, needs every critical thinker it can get. Whew. Okay, well, I'm not going to take it further than that. This is a long video, one that tested my voice box, perhaps as much as it tested your attention. But if you're here, you really need a medal. Thank you very much for listening. And just be aware that listening to intelligent analysis is actually going to improve your memory, your focus, your attention, your ability, your intelligence overall, your ability to cognitively deal with the world around us. So if you're here at this point, well done. And thank you very much. Remember the next video dealing with the autopsy evidence. I'll be playing another card in terms of my theory in that analysis. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.